Vikings, sex, love, and marriage. When we think about the Vikings, love and marriage are usually not the first things that come to mind. However, we might occasionally think about the Vikings and sex when watching one of the many shows and movies about the Vikings in recent years. From TV and movies, you'd almost believe that all Vikings were attractive, always washed, and odor-free. However, it does seem that the Vikings did take relatively good care of their hair. Combs are one of the most common items found in Viking graves and other archaeological sites. But it's hard to believe that these Scandinavian warriors, perhaps of both sexes, weren't more often combing things out than they were getting ready for a party. If Vikings and other medieval topics interest you, please check out our other videos, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Skål! Raiders are not friendly people. There is a three-word phrase often used when describing the Vikings or any other people who made their living by raiding. Those three words are rape and pillage. Today, most of us understand that rape is not sex. Rather, it's a personal violation for any female or male victim. Unfortunately, victims of sexual abuse have never felt differently than they do today, traumatized. In this video, when we say Vikings, we're talking about men. Recent discoveries make it more than likely that there were some Viking woman warriors. However, most historians and archaeologists are still debating their numbers, and the current belief is that the number of female Viking raiders was comparatively few. The Vikings weren't only raiders, they were sexual predators. They raped women, they raped men, boys and girls too. Had you asked a young Viking man how many times he had had sex, he would likely have said something to the effect of, "I've had sex 50 times, except 48 of those times would be considered rape today. No one asked the victim what they thought, if they lived. Many were likely killed right after the act. Vikings and homosexuality. It's not talked about much and definitely not shown, at least not often, but many Vikings were not exclusively heterosexual. Homosexual activity among Vikings was unusual until you know more about it. Like most societies in the Middle Ages, Viking society was dominated by men. Today, sociologists might call Viking society hyper-male, a culture in which the traditionally masculine qualities of aggression, physical prowess, and constant evaluation of one's power relationship to one another was always in the forefront of the mind. One way to show physical dominance was to use another man for pleasure. Viking society did not punish a man for being the dominant participant in homosexual acts. However, those who were submissive were viewed as worthy of less respect than women. Though it's improbable that there were no Viking men who preferred the more passive role, being caught in the act might involve being socially mocked, ostracized, and sometimes killed. The same went for any man, straight or gay, caught wearing women's clothing. That being said, the passive partner in Viking homosexual acts was usually not a willing one. Many times the victim was a slave. Many times it was a vanquished enemy. Rape, especially back then, was a statement of dominance, sometimes a very public one. Much of what we know about Vikings comes from the sagas, the stories of great Scandinavian men and women written down or elaborated upon beginning in the 13th century, at least 200 years after the Viking era ended. The sagas tell us something about relationships, sexual and otherwise. In Viking times, accounts of witnesses from other cultures tell us more, and today's technology allows us to make important deductions about the Vikings just from their remains and treasure. Still, none of this says anything about homosexuality among Viking women. It could be that it was not spoken of, something some women may have engaged in when their man was gone. It might have been that some Scandinavian women were openly lesbian. On the other hand, relations between women might have been illegal, or because it involved women in a hyper-masculine society, it might not have been deemed important. Premarital sex. It's important to remember that the Vikings were a pagan society for most of the Viking era, considered to have lasted from 793 AD to 1066 AD. The relatively learned Christian monks and priests were among the most valuable slaves a Viking could own or sell. Depending on time and place, Christians attempting to spread their religion were often tortured and killed. Christianity preached brotherly love, peace, and redemption. Christians believed in one deity. They turned the other cheek, and they didn't believe that rocks, water, trees, animals, thunder, lightning, rain, and much else had a spirit as the Vikings did. They certainly didn't believe in Odin, Thor, Frey, Freya, Loki, and the other gods of the Norse belief system. That's easy to write and say, but looking deeper, we have to realize that the Vikings saw their world, the universe, and the afterlife, and how to get there much differently than we do. This means that most, not all, of their ideas about sex were radically different than that of their Christian descendants in today's Scandinavia and elsewhere. Though, at least in the Western world, our ideas about premarital sex have changed since the Middle Ages, it's frowned upon in many places, and parents attempt to dissuade their children, especially their daughters, from having sex before marriage. Generally speaking, a losing battle. In Viking society, it wasn't a battle at all. However, that does not mean that the Vikings, at least at home, went around sleeping with anyone they wanted to. Even the Vikings had rules. One of the most important was not getting or getting someone pregnant. We can't be entirely sure how Vikings went about that. Whether it was the acts they engaged in or didn't engage in, natural birth control methods passed down from generation to generation, or the rhythm method. However, a young couple had better do their best to be careful, for an unwanted pregnancy could complicate things as much as it can now. Abortion was not unheard of in Viking times, and even before. However, at best, it was a risky proposition at a time of very basic medical knowledge and technology. Adoption could happen by older relatives, but it was not ideal, especially in times of hunger, war, or disease. As a result, many babies, especially female infants, were killed shortly after delivery. A child could be an asset if the young man and women were of the upper or more powerful classes. It could cement relationships, bring peace, and provide another warrior or a girl who would one day bring a high bride price, but only if the parents got married. It was not forbidden or even looked down on if women had sex outside of marriage. After all, one of the most popular were Frey and Freya, brother and sister, who are often depicted as gods of sexual pleasure and fertility. Still, at least in the sagas, it was considered improper for a woman to have too many partners. We don't know how many partners were too many, and we don't know how open or secret these relationships were either. Of more concern to her parents than any modern idea of a reputation was having an illegitimate child. Remember, people then and now don't think of abortion as a pleasant or routine experience. It's one that most women would rather not go through, all things being equal. Vikings were the same way. Killing a child by exposing it to the elements, not an unknown practice, is not an easy thing to do, either as a Christian or pagan. There were many illegitimate children, and they had to be supported by the mother's family. That meant that dad and mom likely had several talks with their daughters about the birds and the bees. Marriage. Frigg was the wife of the All-Father, the chief Norse god Odin. She was the goddess of marriage, motherhood, and a goddess of fertility. Though people today believe that Fridays are named after either Freya or Frey, Friday is derived from Frigg, and any pagan couple wanting to get married tried to have their wedding on a Friday, or Frigg's Day. Nowadays, at least in America, a wedding in June is the most popular. June is spring and summer. Generally, the temperatures are not too hot and flowers are beginning to bloom. It's a time of abundance and good fortune. The Vikings too had a favorite time of year for weddings, September or early October, harvest time. Harvest time was symbolic, for it was when Frigg caused the crops to grow and would likely bless a new couple with a child. Harvest time also meant more food, which would mean a great and memorable wedding feast with lots of meat, bread, and fruit. Of course, this being a Viking wedding, there would be lots of ale and mead, including a special brew for the newly married couple. This particular brew was made with honey, and well-to-do parents would supply their guests with a month's worth of ale, one cycle of the moon. A honeymoon. Vikings invented the honeymoon. No, not really, but the word and the sentiment stem from Viking times. Many other wedding traditions practiced by the Vikings should be familiar to us today. The exchange of rings, a common symbol all over the world for millennia, exchanged vows, and the groom carrying the bride over the threshold. This last practice was a big deal for the Vikings. Recently, Norwegian Viking scholar Dr. Marianne Hem Eriksson wrote a book called Architecture, Society, and Ritual in Viking Age Scandinavia. In it, she writes of the importance of doors and door frames in Viking houses and how they related to their spirituality. One of the things she found was that in many excavations of Viking Age houses, human bones, usually the bones of a baby or small child, likely children who had died in childbirth or in the first year or two of life, were buried near the doorway of the house. Combined with other discoveries and writings, the placement of the bones there seems to indicate some kind of protection from whatever lies outside the door, likely spirits, trolls, and other mystical beings that the Vikings firmly believed were out there. The door played a crucial spiritual role in Viking life, and pillars with spells or runic warnings were often placed near them. As a result, a Viking groom carrying his bride over the threshold was more than just an awkward good time like it is today. It was an important symbolic moment. The husband was bringing his bride inside where he would protect her from enemies, human and otherworldly. One Viking tradition that isn't so common is the bride's race, or brudløb, in which the bride and groom's families would race each other to the feasting hall. A version of this was shown on History Channel's Vikings, when the brothers Ubbe and Fitzek race around a group of trees. One can imagine that the winning family was supposed to have good luck for the next year, or perhaps have the first toast about them, etc. By the way, having luck was an essential aspect of Viking life. Maybe those races got a bit more competitive than they might be today. After marriage. The Viking world was a man's world. After marriage, he was free to consort with other women and to have other women in his household. If he could afford them, he could have them. This may have angered a few Viking wives, but in many cultures, the practice of having more than one wife or having a wife and several concubines eased the pressures on a wife. Chores or responsibilities were divided, and in the case of a marriage gone wrong, at least wife number one had some time away from the husband she may have grown to dislike or worse. Moreover, any children his mistresses had were legitimate heirs. One reason that power struggles in Viking times often pitted family members against each other. However, a wife who got pregnant by another man faced an unpleasant future. If she were lucky, she might have her head shaved and be publicly shamed. However, it's more likely that she was immediately divorced and sent back to her family. She might be sold into slavery, or she might even be killed. It depended on her husband, the traditions or laws of the area where they lived, and maybe the culture of the time. Divorce not just for men. In some ways, Viking society was just as unfair to women as most others of the time. And while many of the laws and customs were unjust, they did have some advantages over women in other parts of Europe. Viking women could inherit property. The sagas are full of tales of smart and relentless women making something of the farm that was willed to her by her husband and becoming a power, at least behind the scenes in local politics. One thing Viking women were free to do that most other women in the world were not was divorce their husbands. The needs of modern drama have changed history, and on many TV shows about the Vikings, women seem free to divorce their husbands for almost any reason. This is not true. She couldn't just leave her husband because they were incompatible, as many of today's couples become. She definitely could not divorce her husband for another man, and she couldn't divorce him for having sex with another woman. However, she could demand a divorce if he were found to have engaged in any homosexual acts, no matter in what way. And should her partner like to wear women's clothes, which apparently some did because why else would it be a condition of divorce, divorce was not only easy, but the wife could get her dowry back. A woman could also divorce her husband if he hit her. On the first offense, she could tell him to pay a fine. Maybe it was paid, maybe not. But if he struck her again in front of a witness, she could fine him, and if he hit her more than twice, divorce him immediately. Not exactly equal rights, but more rights than most women of the time could dream of. One more thing. The word husband comes to us via Old English, which picked it up from the Norse word husbondi, meaning householder. Not too romantic, but certainly important to the Vikings. We hope you learned something from our video tour of the Vikings' hidden personal lives. If you did, please like and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more videos on unusual topics like this. Thank you.